Acts chapter 7, beginning of verse 44, says, "Our fathers had the tent of witness in the wilderness, just as he who spoke to Moses directed him to make it, according to the pattern that he had seen. Our fathers, in turn, brought it in with Joshua when they dispossessed the nations that God drove out before our fathers. So it was until the days of David, who found favor in the sight of God and asked to find a dwelling place for the God of Jacob. But it was Solomon who built a house for him. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands, as the prophet says, 'Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it.' Now when they heard these things, they were enraged, and they ground their teeth at him. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." Now, can I just go on a rant for a minute? I find it fascinating in this text that as Stephen is preaching, that he senses the turning emotions of the crowd, and he begins to speak truth to an angry mob. He was not going to shy back from the truth of the gospel just because those he was speaking with didn't actually agree with it. And it has come to my attention that it seems like in this generation of God follower, we have decided that when someone has decided to be an enemy of the gospel, that we shall not speak against their truth. We have found it necessary to just lay back in quiet and listen while the world sits here and speaks against the gospel, speaks against the truth of the word of God. And we find it necessary to be quiet. Yet when we look in the gospel, that is not the posture that we see them taking. Rather, when people came out as enemies of the gospel of God, they were firm and they were proud and they were bold as to speak the truth of the gospel. And it didn't matter what everybody thought. It didn't matter that they gnashed their teeth at him. It didn't matter that they disagreed with him. He was standing on the gospel. As we, the church, have become extremely quiet about the gospel of God, the truth of the gospel, the world is actually getting louder with its message, and the louder message is being more influential. I don't think it's time to say less. I don't think it's time to be more quiet. I don't think it's time to take a passive posture. I think now is the time, and this is the moment to stand on the gospel and boldly proclaim, I am not ashamed of the gospel. For only the gospel is the power of God to salvation. Stiff-necked, uncircumcised. I think we know what he meant by that. And yet he wasn't afraid to say it. When will we find our voice that the gospel has given us and stop speaking as the world speaks? This is our time. This is our time. All right, rant over. Let's preach. Take it to the top. It said that there was a tent of witness. Now, when he's talking about this tent of witness, what was he actually meaning? There was a tabernacle that was built by the people of God that God gave a picture of, a vision of the heavenly throne room, and instructed Moses to build on the earth the reflection of the pattern that was in heaven, so that God could have somewhere on the earth to come down and dwell with his people. It was necessary for God to dwell with his people if they were going to be his people and he was going to be their God. So he told them, I need you to build this for me so that I have a place, a holy place, to come dwell among you. And there was an exactness to the pattern. There was perfection to the work that Moses was doing. He didn't just say, oh, okay, I think I'll build a little tent here and maybe we'll throw some candles in the corner and I'll build an altar over there. We'll put it over there. No, the altar was exactly where God told him to put the altar. And the candles were exactly where he told him to place the candles, and the table was where he told him to place the table. And so we have this entire facility that is the tabernacle. And it had a boundary, a property boundary that was a fence. And inside the fence, there was a building that had 2 rooms. It was a tent building with 2 rooms. One you went into, and it was called the holy place. And then you went further behind another veil to the last room. That was the Holy of Holies. It was the holiest place. And in that place, he put a box, an ark, the Ark of the Covenant. And we sometimes get excited about the phrase, the Ark of the Covenant, but I want us to not miss what seems to be hugely important about this piece of furniture, is that it had a lid, and the lid was called the mercy seat. And the mercy seat had angels on it, depicting the throne of God surrounded by angels that Moses saw in the heavens and then constructed it exactly on the earth, at least the best he could with the materials that he had to build it. Just know, whenever God tells you to do something for him, whatever you have to use is enough. Whatever materials you have, if he's asked you to use those for his glory, that is enough. We dare not move on the voice of God because we feel like we don't have the right words or we don't have the right way to get there. You just get there how you get there and use the words that you have and God will move. We trust him to use what we have for his glory. And so they used what they had and they built exactly what was to be built. And it said when Moses finished the work, we start in Exodus 29, go all the way, wander down into Exodus 40. When Moses finished the work, the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God called Mount Sinai, where he gave him the plan for the tabernacle, holy. And then when he built the tabernacle per spec, God called that place holy, and then God filled it with his glory. We will see from building to building to building to building, there is a reflection of a pattern that we are responsible to build so that God will fill what is built with his glory. Just give you a spoiler, so we'll go all the way to the end and then I'll come back to the beginning. They built a tabernacle, they built a temple, they built another temple, and then God says, we're the temple. And just like there were specifications for the first tabernacle and the next temple, God has given us specifications as to how our lives should look to be holy. So now let's jump back. So here we are at the tabernacle. He finished the work. God filled it. This is exactly how they would meet with God. For years, they met with God this way. In the tabernacle, God would speak to them in that place. They would sacrifice in that place. It was that place that there was an altar, and before there was ever the first sacrifice, there was something placed there. And then God, with fire from heaven, consumed the sacrifice. And then they were told, now you keep that fire burning. God lit it the first time. But it was necessary for them to keep the fire burning. The same thing happened on Pentecost when the fire of God came and lit the church up. And then he said, now you guys keep it burning. All right, so now there's this temple. So we see this tabernacle built. Now there is a temple that is to be built. And it was interesting because we don't necessarily see the command of God to build the temple. It just came into the heart of David that he, a man after God's own heart, wanted to build God a temple, a place, a bigger place, a more permanent place of worship. And he wanted to build it on an exact site that actually has massive significance on the earth. There was David had kind of stepped out in his leadership, and he was running a census that God did not want him to run. And the reason why he didn't want him to run the census is because David was wanting to count all the people to make sure he had enough to do some of the things that he wanted to do. And it was sort of kind of a strategic thing or a metric thing or an ego thing, call it whatever you want to call it. But God didn't want the information that he had to give him confidence to do what God told him to do. God just wanted him to have confidence in him to do what he wanted him to do. Sometimes we put confidence in our education, or we put confidence in our savings. Oh, I'll do this when I have it. No. You do what God tells you to do when God tells you to do it. Because when God tells you to do something, there will be more than enough. Always. And so here in this moment, he sinned against God. And so God was judging the people, and then there came a moment where the judgment of God stopped. And in that place where the judgment of God stopped, David wanted to build an altar and give God a sacrifice to say thank you for his mercy. And so he went to the owner of the land. He said, I need to build an altar, so I need to pay you for this. And the man said, no, king, I'll give it to you. And here I love this principle that we see. David says, no, I will pay you what it is worth, because I'm not giving God anything that didn't cost me something. He wasn't looking for free land to build an altar on. Make sure we grasp that. Sometimes church is always looking for free stuff. So we don't have to ask God's people to do what God wants his people to do. David said, no, I will give God nothing that doesn't cost me. And so he buys this land, he builds an altar. And then later on, he gets in his heart to build God a temple, and he wants to build it on that exact location. And so it's in his heart to build it, and he says, I want to build this for you. And God says, that's great, but you're not going to be able to build it for me. I'm going to have your son build it for me. But it said David found favor with God. Now, David didn't get to build the temple, but David found favor. And I think this is a lesson for all of us, because sometimes we think that we're going to be measured by the things that we accomplish, or we think we're going to be measured by the size of whatever we can build or the size of whatever we can amass. And my only goal in life is that I find favor with God. I just want to please God. I want to take whatever he has given me and just work according to the measure of what God has given me, that he will multiply whatever it is that I give him, and he's just pleased with me. Like that's it. If I only make it this high, fantastic if I find favor with God. But if I make it beyond my wildest dreams and I don't please God, woe is me. I want my happiness, I want my joy, I want my peace to be founded on, I found favor with God. David didn't get to build the temple, but he found favor with God. So his son Solomon, according to the plans that David had in his heart, Solomon built the temple. And the temple was more magnificent in appearance than the tabernacle. There were certainly similarities. It had perimeter walls instead of a perimeter fence. It had a big building in the middle that had 2 rooms, just like the tabernacle had 2 rooms. The Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat that was in the Holy of Holies was in the Holy of Holies of the temple that Solomon built. And said when they finished all that they did, they moved the ark into the Holy of Holies, and then the priests walked back out of the temple area. The singers and the musicians began to sing praise to God. For the Lord is good, and his mercy endures forever. And when they sang, it said, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord, like it filled it, so that the priests could not minister anymore because of the glory of God. When God shows up, there's little left for any of us to do. But it's interesting, because a lot of times in the story, I just stop there in 2 Chronicles 5. I just stop. Filled the temple, and the priest could not stand to minister. And it's like, whew, man, that's it. But then it says Solomon stood up, and Solomon prayed. And when Solomon finished praying, the fire of God came from heaven and lit up that altar. So just like God lit the altar in the tabernacle, God lit the altar in the temple. And then again, the glory of the Lord filled the temple, And this time, the priest could not go back into the temple because of the glory of the Lord. There are two moments in the temple when the glory of the Lord came into that place so that they had to stop. They were unable to do what they were doing. There is a pattern that is beginning to build that we see here, that the glory of the temple was greater than the glory of the tabernacle. But then we have this second temple after the first temple was destroyed. Then they're building the second temple. And while they're building this, it was not as impressive as the first one. And there were people, because it wasn't as impressive as the first one, they began to kind of murmur. They were frustrated. So then the word of the Lord came prophetically. And the prophet said, the glory of this house will actually be greater than the glory of the former house. Why? Because God continues to increase every generation from glory to glory to glory to glory. There is always greater glory upon the current generation than the former generation, not because the former generation is less than the current generation, but because as sin increases, so much more does grace abound. As the world gets worse, the glory of God is going to get greater, but we have to desire and look for that glory. Let me just say this. I am not concerned about being a parent raising kids in this miserable generation. I realize that there are more complications right now. I realize there are more temptations right now. I know it's more difficult to be a parent today, but here's what I know. The grace upon a parent today to raise a child in this generation is greater than before. So I do not worry, because even though sin might abound, how much more does grace abound? So we can do this. Why? Because His power is increasing among us. It is becoming more complicated in marriage than it has ever been. Than it's ever been. We have these realities of what a godly marriage looks like, and the voices of the world are coming against that. There are temptations upon men that are far more accessible than were accessible 50 years ago that makes being a man of purity harder than it's ever been. But I'm not concerned about that, because greater is the glory upon the men today than was available back then. Why? Because where sin abounds, how much more does grace abound? There is a neo-feministic voice that is speaking into the lives of moms and wives in God's house today that is louder than it's ever been. And it's telling them that it's okay to not be a godly woman. It's trying to redefine what a godly woman looks like. But I don't care how loud their voices get, because what I know is that the glory of God that is available through the gospel of God will increase, and we will have women that are holier than women of old. Why? Because the grace is greater. The glory of this house will be greater than the glory of the former house. It's a pattern that we see. It's not just about furniture. It's not just about scale and dimensions. It's about the glory of God. And so here in the middle of this conversation about tents and temples, then he quotes the prophet, who says that God does not dwell in temples made with hands. Now here's where we have to sort of kind of dig a little deeper, because our generation tends to use this as an excuse to neither support the building of the house of God nor the gathering together in the house of God. But before I jump into that, let me just say I have no agenda here. Our words are not being pinned or formed to encourage something to fix a problem. People talk about COVID. We've already recovered. We're already there. We already made it. God is working amazing things among us. We have more money being given today than was given last year, than was given the year before that, than was given the year before that, given for the year before that. Look, we're doing amazing. God is moving. You are using what God has given you to build the house of the Lord, not just with your finances, but with what He's really after, which are people. God's moving. And we are grateful. But what I know is, as the voice outside gets louder and louder, it can sometimes cause us to question that which we believe. So what do we need to do? We need a firm foundation. We go back to the gospel to make sure I believe that I'm doing what I should be doing. Because if I don't believe I'm doing what I should be doing, then something's going to distract me and take me away. So here we are. He quotes the prophet, and he says, God does not dwell in temples. So how should we understand that? What is the fullness of what that is to mean? Jesus gives us quite a bit of insight here in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 21. He says, whoever would swear by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. So Jesus is saying that in definition, the earth as God's footstool and heaven as his throne means that God is omnipresent. He is everywhere. He dwells in the heavens and he dwells on the earth. That means that he cannot be contained by a building like some puny God is contained by a building, but rather heaven is his throne, the earth is his footstool. But if the earth is his footstool, then as God dwells and fills the heavens, God dwells and fills the earth. So this place absolutely is filled as a dwelling of God. Let's push a little further. In 2 Chronicles, before Solomon finished the work, in chapter 2 and verse 6, he said it like this: who is able to build a house for God, since the heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain him? Then he makes it personal. Who am I to build a house for him, except as a place where offerings can be made before him? So he recognized that it was not about the gold or the pillars or the building or the scale, but it was about the offering that would be made in that place, that God would come and consume, that God would come and he would actually dwell among that offering, among those people. Sometimes we stop short in our reading and we just say, okay, I made it as far as Exodus, so God is this. And we get real excited. I have buddies, man, they love the Old Testament because they just love the war stories. They love all the smiting and the dying and the like fire consuming people. Like the best, one of my favorite stories absolutely in the Bible is when Elijah is there on the mount and he calls fire down from heaven and then they slaughter hundreds of false prophets. I think it's awesome. I read that story and I'm like, how amazing would that be to just line them all up, whoever they are, just line them all up. I can't even go further in the story. You know exactly how I feel. And God just work a work. Right? And so we get in there and we're like, man, God is so just. God judges the misery of sin. God is just a consuming fire. And we get all excited about it. And we're like, yes, God kills people. And that's what we believe, because that's as far as we read. And then we get over into the New Testament, read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we're like, man, God is so nice and loving and kind, and he heals everybody. Everybody gets healed. Everybody gets a new car. Everybody gets a new house. This is just, man, God is amazing. He doesn't kill anybody. And then we get to Acts, and we make it to Ananias and Sapphira. Who died in the presence of God. And then we're like, okay, well, maybe everybody doesn't get a new car. Maybe we're back to God killing everybody. But what about all of this? And so it forces us to not stop and say God is this until we've read the fullness of who he has shown us that he is. And so then I have to understand that unrighteousness is judged. And so I guess God does still judge as he always judged. And God is kind to 1,000 generations, and God does bless, and God does heal, and God does deliver, because God has always delivered. God has always healed. So yes, God is loving, but God is also just. And I have to embrace both of those things, that God is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and that he's the lamb that was slain. He's not just the lamb that was slain, but he's also the Lion of the tribe of Judah. We see this in the book of Revelation when John is upset because nobody's worthy to open the seals. And he's crying, and an angel says, oh, calm down. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And he's like, yes, the Lion, the seals, judgment. And I saw a lamb. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, but I saw a lamb that was slain. And we're forced to hold the tension of God who is just and God who is loving. Because he's not just one or the other. He's both. He doesn't dwell in temples, but he dwells in temples. He doesn't dwell in a temple, but he dwells in this temple. And so we embrace the magnitude, the greater magnitude of God. We see it in Acts chapter 17 and verse 24. It says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being the Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by hands of men, as though he needed anything, for he gives to all. Now, let me ask you this. Do we serve God? Yes. But he says God isn't served with hands. So he can't mean that God isn't served with hands. What he means is God isn't served with hands as though God needs something. And he said God doesn't dwell in temples. But he doesn't mean God doesn't dwell in temples, but that God isn't limited to dwelling in a temple because the earth is his footstool and heaven is his throne. This is something that our generation has a real problem with. When we talk about serving someone who doesn't need it, that actually bothers us. Because we like to give to causes. We see somebody who has everything, we actually want to take away from them. We never ever think that we give honor to someone like the boss or our teacher or a leader. We don't give honor upline. All we want to do is give to causes downline. We want to give to something that makes us feel better. This is going very well here. Just follow me. I want to give to someone homeless because I have a home and I have an extra $5, so somehow I'm better than them. Now, I'm not saying you think you're better. What I'm saying is the motivation is that I have something they don't have, so I'm going to give it to them because they need what I have, so I'm going to willingly give this. The lesser is blessed by the greater. And then I see somebody who has no food, and I'm going to feed them because the lesser is blessed by the greater. And I see someone who has no clothes, so I'm going to provide clothes for them. By the way, every bit of this is commanded in the gospel. We are absolutely to clothe the naked. We're absolutely to called to feed the hungry. We're absolutely called to give residence to the homeless, shelter to the homeless, 1,000%. But not as a substitution for giving to he who is greater. Why? Because Hebrews says very clearly that we who are lesser, when we give to the greater with our tithe, that the greater gives blessing to the lesser. Does God need it? No. $10 million stack of bricks. Does he need this? Does God need this? No. We could meet out in the parking lot, every single one of us, and sweat and stink and be miserable. So we build God a house for us to gather in. Does he have to have this? No. But he asks for it. Throughout the generations, God has asked his people to give to him, though he has need of nothing. Let's look at it like this. Next week is Father's Day. Every single child in my house has nothing that I have not given them. Nothing. They don't pay for their meals. They don't pay for their clothes. They don't pay for their roof. They don't pay for anything. They are consumers parasites. Sucking the life right out of me. Next week is Father's Day. I am greater than they are. I have more than they have. I need nothing. But they better show up next week with something. We've forgotten what honor is. In our willingness to only give where there is need, rather than give because of who someone is, we're missing this concept of honor. And we have to bring it back. God isn't served by hands as if he needs it, but he's called you to serve him. God doesn't need your worship as if he's not greater, but he's asked for you to worship. And Solomon was saying the purpose of that temple was for there to be an offering before God, a place where an offering was made. And so did God dwell in that temple? He absolutely did dwell in that temple. And so Jesus comes in and he gives us sort of this new framework for worship. In John chapter 4 and verse 21, he's at this place, this town called Samaria. Now, there was a significance to that town because it was in the former place called Shechem. And Shechem was a place where Abraham heard the promise of God, and so he built an altar there. And then Jacob heard the promise of God in that same place. Jacob came back to that same place, and Jacob bought land in that same area and dug a well there. And so because he dug a well there in that place, that when Israel had a big national separation, one group went one way, one group went another way. Jerusalem was the capital of the one group. Samaria was the capital of the other group. And so there in Samaria, they built a temple. And that's where God was worshiped. And the Samaritans said, no, this is where God is worshiped. And those in Jerusalem said, no, this is where God is worshiped. And so she has a real question. Is it here or is it there? Is it the place that Jacob, our father, bought? Or is it the place that David bought? Which one is it? And Jesus says, woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. But the hour is coming and now is here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. So the purpose of the place has always been about worship. And the only person that can give worship is a true worshiper. And so a true worshiper has to worship in truth. So that's talking about the person. A true worshiper worships in truth, but in spirit is talking about the place. So who is that true worshiper? Who worships in truth? It's that person that, first of all, understands what worship is. I love this moment in the life of Jesus. He's been led by the Spirit into the wilderness not being a broken place, the wilderness being a personal place of just finding and hearing the voice of God. We talked about it weeks ago where we just get away and away from all the hustle, and we just find space where we can be us alone in the presence of God where he can speak. Jesus is in that place, led by the Spirit to be in that place. But in that place, the devil came to actually tempt him. And he said, why don't you worship me and I'll give you everything? And in Luke chapter 4 and verse 8, Jesus says, it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only will you serve. Now he said, it is written, you shall worship. If we go back to where it is written, it is back under the law in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 13. And it says, you shall fear the Lord, and him only shall you serve. Now how do we get from fear to worship? Because it's the same thing. It's just in our generation, we don't want to recognize that we worship the one whom we fear. Because we don't act like God ever judges anything. We don't act like there's still a call to holiness in our lives. So if there's not, then I don't have to fear God. I just worship him. But we have to understand that word worship has to include that word fear. It has to be understood that God is greater, that God has made a demand. God has given a command. And because he's greater, I respond to it and I obey it. Why? Because I fear him. What does that mean? That means I worship him. So when I obey God because of his commands, that is an act of worship. And as an act of worship of obedience, I now come into his presence and give him my singing as a holy vessel. Now I offer a sacrifice of praise that he accepts because I've obeyed him. I worship who I fear. Let's keep moving. In spirit. So if not in Samaria or not in Jerusalem, then where? He says in spirit. He's just pushing the narrative that it's not about a particular place, but it's about anywhere that you are called to worship him. The Apostle Paul said it like this in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 8. He said, I desire that in every place men pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or quarreling. Now, the word place there, we can sometimes kind of miss it because it's just used the word place, but it's actually speaking deeper to a sacred place, a sanctuary place. It's not talking about I'm walking in Walmart and I just stop and offer up prayers. I mean, you can, but that's not the meaning of the text. He's not saying walk into Publix and just stop the entire line and throw up a prayer. In every place, in every sacred space, every dedicated place, every sanctuary, that there should be prayer. It's exactly what Jesus said when he came down into the temple that they had turned into a den of thieves. He said, my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. What was he doing? He was restoring the glory of God back to the temple. So Paul is saying that for the glory of God to be in any sacred place, there has to be prayer in that place, given by what? Someone with holy hands. So he's talking about a place, but he's also talking about a person. When God said that he had set apart Israel, was he talking about the land or was he talking about the people? Yes. Both. When we are talking about family worship center, are we talking about this place or are we talking about you? Yes. Both. This place is holy because you who have holiness in you gather in this house. This place has significance because of who God has called you to be and your worship that you all offer at this altar. So this place does matter, but only because you matter. And so here's how we have to see this. It's exactly as God said it in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16. He said, do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? The tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, the glory of God, I get it. The temple, built by a king, the Holy of Holies, with an Ark of the Covenant, the same one, fire coming, the glory filling, I get it. Me? Graduated from Bartow High School? Born at Lakeland General Hospital? Not New York or Austin or Dallas, home of the legendary Cowboys? Nope. Me. Not that temple, not that tabernacle. Me. The dwelling of God. Do you not know that you are the temple of God? You are. We're not talking about a tabernacle or a temple anymore. We're talking about you. You are the temple of God. God dwells in you. But he further explains that. And this is where we cannot lose the message. Because as there were specifics about the tabernacle and about the temple and about the second temple, there are specifics about this temple too. And he pushes the conversation further in chapter 6 and verse 18. He says, flee. By the way, this is the moment where if you're like, I don't want to hear a preacher get grouchy, just go ahead and just text somebody. Do something. Be about 5 minutes. I'll see you at 12:18. He says, flee from sexual immorality. For all other sins are outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you have been bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. I've heard people say that all sin is the same. No, it's not. No, it's not. All other sins are outside the body. But the sexually immoral person sins against their own body, which is the temple of God. It's not the same. It'll never be the same. We need to quit diminishing the importance of holiness in our body. It matters. Your body matters because your body is the temple of God. That's a big deal. But we need to make sure we pick up something here. He says, you are the temple of the Holy Spirit. That you is in a second person plural, which is only expressed in the South. No other place understands what that word you means. It's y'all. The word there is y'all. And I know everybody else is like, oh, Southern people, I don't know what you're talking about. These come down from the North. Now, yous guys have such a weird way of saying, yous guys have a weird way of saying things? Yous guys? No, y'all have the problem. We actually know exactly what's going on. I'll take y'all over yous guys any day. It goes further. It goes further like 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 4. I want us to make sure we get the plurality of this. He says, as you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, that's y'all. You yourselves is the gospel version of y'all. You yourselves, like living stones, plural, are being built into a spiritual house to be a royal, holy priesthood. A holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices to God, acceptable to God through Jesus. Jesus, the cornerstone, Jesus, the living stone that was rejected by men. As we come to him, how do I come to him who has been rejected by men? I have to step out of the place where the rejection is coming from, and I have to go to the one who's been rejected. I can't stay among those who are rejecting him. I have to come to him. That means I have to offend because I leave. That means I have to offend because I say this is the right way. That way I have to offend because I know truth is there and this is not truth. Anything, any word, any message that rejects Jesus is not truth. Any message that rejects the gospel is not truth. And so I have to leave what is not true and come to him who is true. I cannot serve him here. I can't. I can't embrace the lies of the world and expect to serve Jesus. I will never do it. And this is the problem. We look more like the world than the church than we ever have because we consume everything that they have to say, and the church is always the last voice we listen to. The gospel is always the last place we go. We always get all of our opinions and our attitudes and our stupid terminology from the world, and then we try and push it into the gospel. It's never going to work. Ever. So I have to leave and come to him who was rejected. If he was rejected by the world, what does that mean about me? Rejected. Thank God. Count it all joy. Count it all joy. As Moses would rather be persecuted with the children of God than enjoy the riches of Egypt, so be us. So be us. But the point of the text is actually this, that it's y'all. You yourselves are being built into a spiritual house. It's not about me, it's about us. It's always been about us. It's always been about a people. It's always been about a kingdom. We have gotten so selfish and self-centered that we don't want to see the fullness, the robustness of the family, the household of God. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, the Apostle Paul says, you may know how you ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. The church is the household that you have been called to be a part of, that you have been called to behave in. Is it about you? Yes, as long as it's about us. Is it about us? Yes, as long as it includes you. It's us and, it's you and, it's all of it. It has to be. Let's wrap it up with this one. I love this text, Ephesians 2:19. God says, you are fellow citizens with the saints, members of the household of God, built on the apostles and the prophets, the gospel from Genesis to Revelation, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Jesus Christ himself, the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure is being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. And then he goes on and he says, in him also, y'all, are being built into the dwelling place of God by the Spirit. We are, when we come together, holy vessels, separated stones to be used by God, to be built together. When we come together, we become the dwelling place of God. And where God is, there is freedom. Where God is, there is power. Where God is, there is truth. Where God is, there are miracles. There is healing. There is wisdom. There is revelation. There is understanding. There is deliverance. There is encouragement. Where God is, there is peace. Where God is, there is joy. We, you, me, we are the dwelling place of God.